I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true good and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Dean, what's your favorite animal?
Whoa, tough. Right on the spot.
Yep.
I've been watching a lot of TikToks about blue whales lately, and I think TikTok thinks my favorite animal is the blue whale, and it might be right.
Huh. That's cool. I mean, TikTok can't be wrong. What about blue whales do you like?
I like how big they are. I like how nice they are. I like how blue they are. Pretty much everything about them. Those are the 3 big facts about blue whales, and I like them all.
That's great. Yeah, a lot to love about these big whales. The biggest babies on the planet, besides right-wing politicians.
That's right. And you, what's your favorite member of the beastly kingdom?
Man, I would be lion if I didn't say lion is not my answer. I would be lion if I didn't say I love a good raccoon. I think raccoons are great.
Do you love a bad raccoon?
Yeah, I think even if they're a bad raccoon, I'd kind of love them anyway. It's just little rascally guys. It's pretty good.
Yeah, anything that really wants your trash is pretty intriguing, I gotta say.
Even possums. My son, he loves possums. And every time we see a video of them, he says, I can't believe mom doesn't like these things. I'm like, yeah, I can't believe it either.
I saw one just yesterday, actually. Possum Watch.
Oh, no way.
24. It's already happened.
One time when my son was like 3, we were walking into our house and there was this giant possum in our tree. And he said, look, it's a big angry cat.
Kind of.
Who can say how angry he was? But I could see how that would be I could see how that's like what you'd get from just looking at a possum the first time.
True. Distorted by his anger into that particular shape.
Yeah, exactly. That's what they do look kind of angry. Anyways, it's I'm asking you this question for the sake of the podcast. I mean, I care personally what animals you like, but I'm asking you right now specifically for the podcast. We've been talking about St. Francis the last few weeks. Last week we talked about Pope Francis and St. Francis, and that's cool. We're still on this Francis kick, but like in a different register. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of St. Francis now. You guys might know that Dean and I are writing a book that has some things to do with St. Francis. So we're like diving down into the depths of St. Francis thought. And this week we were really thinking about St. Francis and the relationship he has to animals. There are like a lot of stories about St. Francis and animals out there in the world. There are a lot of these stories. This is I've not made notes for this. This is just my own recollection, so maybe this is less than accurate. But there are multiple stories about St. Francis, like rescuing an animal from a trap and then just kind of like setting it on its way. Like there's one about St. Francis like getting a fish that somebody had caught and then putting it back in the water, and then he tells the fish like, "Don't get caught again."
Yeah.
You idiot.
There are at least 3 rabbit stories that are exactly the same. And
that's
all
right.
That same story.
And the animals, they never learn. They get caught every time. It is interesting, though. An interesting approach to animals that you rescue them from traps. You tell them, don't get caught. And then they do anyways. There are a lot of other stories, though, I think, about animals that are not about getting caught in traps. There's one that's really interesting that I think is worth talking about that might kind of set the tone for this episode. And maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but this is a story of of St. Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio. Story, it goes something like this. Just outside the city of Gubbio, this is also an abridged version that I'm giving you right here. This is not
You're
the
not
official.
reading this?
No. So outside of Gubbio, there was a big, angry, ferocious wolf, and it ate the city's livestock and basically anyone else that would come around this dang wolf. It ate everybody. So everyone was mad about that. They didn't like this wolf. But Francis, he decided he was going to take care of this whole situation. He left the city to make a deal with the wolf. He said to the wolf, literally, he said it. He spoke it with words. Stop eating people. Just live in peace with the city. The people will just like feed you instead of like you eating them.
I love. Sorry, just to pause. I just really feel like there needs to be a sort of drunk hagiography episode at some point with you telling me stories of saintly miracles and lives, because that's what it feels like is happening, and I'm pretty here for it. I would listen to that episode of our podcast for sure. I'm
not drunk, but I do not feel very good, so it's kind of like halfway there. Sick hagiographies. So anyways, let me get back to it. It's so important. He makes this deal with the wolf not to eat anybody, and that's interesting because well, first of all, you can't talk to wolves like that usually, but when he's having this like conversation about a truce with the wolf, or like kind of a calling a peace with the wolf. It's interesting because Francis like recognizes that the reason that the wolf is eating people is because the wolf is hungry and the city is like encroaching on the wolf's territorial situation, right? He can't eat all the things he used to because the city is growing. So anyways, it's interesting that in the story, that's what Francis recognizes about the wolf, that there's like this kind of connection between humans and animals. It's not just and that's maybe a theme of a lot of Francis stories about animals. I think sometimes they get really romanticized or whatever. As you know, Francis is the guy who's like talking to birds and whatever. That's cool. But there's this kind of recognition of thinking with animals in Francis's life that I think is, I don't know, worth considering. It's a way of thinking about animals and ecology even that we don't do very often as people in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to like Disneyfy St. Francis, I guess, where he belongs in, I don't know, Cinderella or whatever, where all the birds are like helping her put her clothes on or cook her breakfast or whatever it is that she does. And I feel like, you know, it's easy to imagine Francis in that kind of sanitized way, but there is something pretty radical about Francis blurring the boundary between what humans and animals are and how they dialogue with each other and what it means to see them in relationship, and not even in a relationship of utility, but of kind of mutual recognition. The Wolf of Gubbio story is so great because the idea isn't to like make the wolf leave or drive it out. That's what you get in some other saintly stories, right? Like the kind of famous narratives of saints going and slaying dragons and stuff is like, this is a beast that cannot be redeemed. It can only be destroyed. And Francis's approach is always to figure some weird solution out that ends in a kind of conversation. Even the idea of kind of rescuing animals from traps and letting them go and just warning them not to get caught again is really fun because he's also not telling people like not to hunt them. He's just like, hey, I saved you this time, but like you're on your own next time. You know, there's this kind of like recognition that there are these acts of mercy, but they're always done in dialogue. Seeing humans and animals as part of the same situation. And I mean, we're not animal studies people, and there are lots of people who have written animal stuff about theology, but we're not reading them this time around. Instead, as Matt and I have been thinking about St. Francis, we've also been just taking the time to think about animals in weird ways, and we found a really wild book to do it with. So we're gonna do it. We're gonna read these weird essays about animals and see if we can Francis our way through it in the next 50 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. So we decided to take a look at a book that is, like you said, pretty far outside of our disciplines and experience. The book is called Animalia, an Anti-Imperial Bestiary of Our Times. And the book is cool. It's a collection of essays edited by Antoinette Burton and Renissa Milani. The book is very neat because it is like in some ways it is very playful as a book. It just, every chapter is A is for ape, B is for boar, C is for cattle. So it reminds me of a book that you would have when you were a little kid. But every chapter tells you about the very complicated relationship that each of these animals have with imperialism, especially within the context of like British imperialism, because that's the sort of context they're writing in. But it's pretty neat. So in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the big ideas in Animalia and consider what it might mean to practice a type of like Franciscan thinking with animals approach in 2024. This is one of those episodes where we're going to read a book and it's kind of like vibes based, and I think that's great. But I think the main point though is this: like Francis has a really particular way of thinking about animals and like using them to help us think about the world differently and our kind of place within it, right? But other people have different ways of thinking about animals, like, you know, as ways to enclose land and colonize people, or ways to racially categorize people or something. So I think it's worth kind of like sticking with this as a way of thinking and a way of maybe interrogating the big givens of being a human and like, you know, thinking that we have supremacy and all this kind of stuff. So a different route to maybe think about the world through, and I think it's worth doing.
I think you're right. It is worth doing for sure. And it's fun too, because you can use animals as interesting ways to get into all kinds of stuff. Like you said, race, imperialism, there's some great stuff in here on capitalism. Animals have a lot to do with gender. You know, the term husband comes from animal husbandry, extremely weird, very bizarre. And what's great about this book is that it is playful. As you said, you can kind of like dip in on one animal, and, you know, you don't have to read it A to Z. But you get a sort of like gestalt of how British imperialism thinks by thinking through its relationship to animals. So the intro kind of lays this out in a really neat way. It says, the British Empire was entangled in animal life at every possible scale, whether as imaginative resources, military vehicles, settler foodstuffs, status emblems, contested signs, or motors of capital. Animals drive both the symbolic and political economy of modern imperialism wherever it took root. If imperial sovereignty was biopolitical, determining who could live and who must die, it was because the quest for racial supremacy was a pursuit of species supremacy, and vice versa. And if empire was a project dedicated to organizing hierarchies of lives worth living, the human and animal distinction served as a recurrent reference point for who is expendable and who would flourish. How we talk about the Animalia of empire, then, is critical to how we narrate the force of imperial power. I think it's just interesting to kind of think about animals also as these kinds of, I don't know, creatures that get sucked into imperial designs and strategies, and even through doing that have these knock-on effects on how humans treat other human beings and vice versa. The way humans treat one another cascades down into how we also treat animals. And it's making me think a lot about animals in my own life. I have 2 cats. One of them has been scratching at this door the whole time because he's very hungry and his food's not in here, but he wants me to get it for him. And what a very funny thing that instead I'm doing this podcast and I'm just going to go feed him later and hang out. And I think, you know, there is a lot of interesting kind of power imbalances naturally between humans and especially domesticated animals. And anyway, let's get into some of the imperial angles here. Matt, why don't you start us off by talking about A is for ape?
Yeah, I would love to. Okay. So some of this book, kind of as a preface to getting into this, some of this book is about animals, like explicitly, like animals at the level of biological reality. And some of this book is more about like the cultural understanding of those animals. And some of them is about like the imaginary aspect of like how we think about animals in the world. And A is for ape has a little bit to do with each of those sort of subsections or substrates of, I don't know, reality or whatever, each of those aspects of animals. So A is for ape is a chapter written by a person named Amy E. Martin, and it's very interesting. So ape is a classification of animals, right? Ape is not like a specific animal. It's like it's a big group of them. And what's interesting about apes is that, first of all, the word, I didn't know this until I read this chapter. Ape is a word that means to like mimic, right? To mimic a human. So from the very beginning, ape is like type of ambiguous classification of a group of animals that are like able to act like human. They have some kind of human qualities about them, but they are like fundamentally subhuman, but they have this type of like uncanny quality to them, uncanny character, where sometimes they have human emotions, kind of, but sometimes they don't, depending on how, you know, you're looking at them or whatever. They're kind of like humans, but they're not. That's what I'm trying to say. The in-between quality of apes gives like the Western world this bad template, though, to follow in terms of the hierarchy of being. And that is a word I'm using, or that's a phrase I'm using kind of uncritically here, but I'm referencing like a whole group of things, like not just So when we talk about the hierarchy of being, I think we can talk about a certain way of imagining Darwinian evolution where like there's sort of a moral quality to it or something where humans are very good and they're at the top and everything else is like less morally good or less important or something. But also we can just talk about it in the ways that we kind of imagine the importance of being in the world in terms of like people being at the top and so forth. Anyways, but apes have a lot to do with like the subhuman in popular culture, especially in like the sort of Victorian culture. That's like the context we're talking about here. But they have this almost human quality, and that almost human quality that we get from Darwin, but also other sort of biological thinkers before Darwin, it lends a lot of gas to the racial discourse in Victorian England. Here's a quote from this chapter. Amy E. Martin writes, apes could call attention to a troubling kinship between human and animals. They also serve both to invoke and reject a troubling common humanity between colonizer and colonized, between slave owner and slave. The domination of colonized people was often legitimized through the use of an evolutionary scale of humanity and racist associations between colonized and apes. Right? It's this idea that like people who are not white, they're a little bit less than. They're a little bit further down the evolutionary line than white people, right? This is like the hierarchy of being thing I was talking about a minute ago, where it's like, you know, of course the most evolved people in the world are going to be white people from England for some reason, right? But that's like the imaginary part. That's the imaginary way that people are relating to this like weird biological thing that's happening in terms of like Darwinian evolution and so on. It's complicated, but you know, that type of thinking isn't necessarily in Darwin, but it is like a thing that people have very quickly adapted to that type of thinking and kind of connected it all together. Amy Martin goes on to write that apes demarcated that which threatened the human and middle-class European values in terrifying ways. In particular, after Darwin, apes represented in travel, naturalist, and literary narratives. They appeared as violent, destructive, villainous, and preternaturally strong. So, you know, there's this like explosion of you know, writing about travel, about biology, about animals and stuff like, you know, in this time. And apes were always like the scary the scary thing out there. And you can I guess you can kind of follow the logic a bit, not in a good way, in a bad way, but it's like it's a thing that's almost human. It's sort of like lurking in our evolutionary past. It's like it's subhuman. It's the stuff that didn't make the cut. We've evolved away from it and so on. But you can see it like emerge in all kinds of other types of you know, popular culture and visual culture. Something that this essay mentions really specifically that I think is interesting is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as like Mr. Hyde sort of like this like hairy guy that comes out of Dr. Jekyll, and he's like ape-like. He has all these ape-like qualities, and he's, you know, strong and scary and mean and all this kind of stuff. But also all kinds of other bits from this particular time period, like Alan Quatermain, who's like a gorilla hunter. You might know him from the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but this is
that's exactly
before
where I know him from.
Yeah, exactly. This is before that, though. Before Alan Moore did something to him. And then also things like King Kong, right? It's just sort of the same vibe. A big scary monster steals a white woman. That's the vibe of it, right? It's bad. But you can see that type of like the ways that biological thinking and racial thinking are joined together in a really potent and gross kind of concoction that white people love throughout history.
Yeah, there. I mean,
Amy,
we've talked about this piece in Willem Flusser before. This weird Brazilian media theorist. He wrote a really weird book about vampire squids called The Vampiritudes Infernalis, and it is a weird book, but there's a really important passage in it where he says that Darwinian ways of thinking about the world are right wing, precisely because they lead in a progressive direction that ends with human beings at the top, and everything else is kind of like a prefigured human or a malformed human or something that's not quite human. And the key is that the human represents the perfect image at the end. And of course, in particular, the European human. There's a cultural piece to it, racial piece to it. Whereas Flister says, Francis is the left-wing vision of biology, where everything is in a sibling to relationship on a more horizontal plane. And I think that's one reason that Matt and I started thinking about writing this book is actually from, I think, just that incredibly weird paragraph in that Willem Flister book. But I think there's something true about it, right? That the biological story of evolution really obviously licenses tons of racial discourse. I mean, you see it in the way that especially Europeans talked about slavery and the kind of natural racial dimensions of slavery and so on. Even some abolitionists used that kind of language to be like, they have some paternalistic duty to like raise the other races further along the evolutionary scale or whatever. And I think that's one way that the Franciscan vision kind of cuts through that stuff, which is to say there's not a hierarchy of being, or shouldn't be. At the end of the day, like the wolf is not less human or subhuman or lower on the chain of humanity. It's one other creature that we have to sort of dialogue with. And I mean, there's lots of interesting literature too on indigenous spirituality and Franciscan spirituality that kind of have, I think, an extremely complicated relationship, given that the Franciscans were also the colonizing power in the Americas. But,
sure,
lots of interesting Franciscan reflections on sort of a more egalitarian spiritual relationship among creatures and things, anyway, that you kind of intuit in a Franciscan vision.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. I think that in the United States, when it comes to like the imagination around the racial discourse in terms of like apes, at least, it's like a deeply anti-black sort of story to tell.
Yeah,
and I think that's definitely true in Europe as well. But the example that's given in this chapter of the book is actually about Irish people, which is, unsurprising, I guess. But Amy Martin finishes the chapter with this bit here. She says, colonial modernity is not disrupted by resistance to injustice and exploitation, but by the very nature of those who refuse to be incorporated into the civilizing mission. As Irish people who have participated in anti-colonial movements were understood as apes, they were cast outside of the fold of human. The ape continually marked the porous and mutable boundaries between colonizer and colonized, between those understood as a population to be managed through domination, bureaucratic rule, and those who claimed the right to power, and between those whose violence was rationalized as a form of progress and whose resistance was racialized and deemed a vestige of the ape in humankind. So kind of, I think, saying something similar to what you were saying a minute ago, but without the Franciscan part. But yeah, it's that the Darwinian thinking is, I don't think that Darwin thinks this, because in his books he explicitly does not, right? That like we shouldn't do this. But there is a type of right-wing thinking that's kind of latent in that is troubling, that you can definitely see whether Darwin intends this or not. It doesn't matter, because people definitely just picked it up and kind of vibed with it a little too much,
Yeah, I mean, there's also something here that I think is really interesting in light of Cedric Robinson's stuff on racial capitalism, because one thing that Robinson does that I think is really interesting is to say that anti-Black racism is, a constitutive kind of racism in racial capitalism as it develops in modernity and colonial modernity and so on. But it's premised on the racializing habits that preceded, especially the slave economy and so on, because capitalism has always been a racializing system. And he points to the British and Irish distinction as one of them, right? That this is a racializing form that kind of crops up even at the beginning of capitalism in Britain, through enclosure processes and so on. And much of the rhetoric and kind of ways of thinking and logic that was used to dispossess Irish people of their land was also used to dispossess indigenous peoples in the Americas, and also used to kind of see a natural relationship between the superiority of the British as opposed to, the people that they stole land from, including anti-Black racism, but lots of other forms of racism. And I think the key is to point out that like racial capitalism is a kind of meta category, and it's one that, maybe the history of apes sort of like gives you one more angle on, how bizarre racializing thinking in fact really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Well, speaking of totalizing racial thinking, let's talk about dogs. D is for dogs.
D is for dogs. This chapter is really interesting. It's by a person named Heidi J. Nast For more than 30,000 years, humans and dogs domesticated one another through the mutuality and immediacy of their needs. The relationship became significantly less egalitarian over the next several millennia, particularly in civilizational contexts where selective breeding commenced to create dogs physically tailored for war, hunting, herding, and even the sleeve or lap. With the rise of the British Empire, selective breeding assumed much greater political and economic importance as its productivity circulated through and gathered force from two imaginaries used to elaborate the international. One, the industrial standard, and two, the biological race, their synergy showing the degree to which empire and industry were inseparable. Standardization identified the uniformity of mechanically produced industrial goods with a purity reminiscent of race found in the standard new logical and practical means of hierarchically parsing, ordering, and organizing bodies in space. So a lot of important academic words, but the key, I think, right, is that dogs have this kind of interesting relationship with human beings and vice versa. You see this as a pretty standard example in Donna Haraway's thinking and a lot of other sort of animal thinking. Dogs are like the quintessential, like story of how humans and the so-called natural world kind of are like, they make impressions on each other, they constitute each other, they create each other together in these interesting ways. But something happens in especially the rise of racial capitalism, where dogs get sort of like pulled into these really violent kinds of genetic programming, where, you know, you're trying to make a dog specifically great at fighting other dogs, for example, or killing other people, or hunting stuff that you want to hunt. They become less like, less of a seemingly mutual relationship. And surely it's probably not good to like romanticize the human dog relationship or whatever. I'm sure there's a lot of bad stuff going on there too. But there's something kind of weird about how dogs get, as this person says, kind of standardized, serialized. They become kind of consumer products. And, we see that with dogs today, like they're being bred specifically for incredibly weird, like market desires. Or I think I read this weird article a while back about how like the creator of the Golden Doodle is like having second thoughts about what they've brought into the world. It's kind of like monstrosity of consumer demand. I know.
I have one, and it's true though. I mean, everyone has one. There's like there's a weird market around it though. There's a political economy of Golden Doodles, and maybe it's too much.
Exactly, but that's kind of the idea, right? Is like, what are the market demands that kind of basically impinge on the biological story of a creature, and then again the kind of racializing demands or racializing habits and patterns that sort of emerge from all that too, from seeing dogs as objects of utility, seeing them as having certain kinds of habits, and also breeding them for particular features and not other features. It's a bit of a eugenic. It is a eugenic process.
Yeah.
So dogs and imperialism. What a wild history.
Yeah, there's also this really interesting part in this chapter too about gender in dogs. There's this kind of interesting story about the rise of dog fighting in Britain. And how it kind of comes with a particular sort of proletarian background of like miners and stuff. But as dogfighting was outlawed in Britain, and it was like obviously hyper masculine and that kind of thing, is you could imagine dogfighting might be. I don't want to imagine dogfighting at all, but I want to imagine dog snuggling. But as dogfighting was phased out, but then like a more feminine form of like dog existing with kind of came into being, and like there were like lots of toy dog clubs and things like that. So anyways, another interesting note about it. Okay, one more though. There is this other part of the story too, about the British Empire like stealing Pekingese dogs from China specifically, right. And then they become this huge fetishized kind of thing in the I guess English speaking world, which is very bizarre too. So stupid. Dogs, I love them, and we've done immeasurable damage to them, I think, probably.
Yeah, also that we can have our very own little guys. There's also a lot of interesting stuff in there about, the ways that, like, dogs impinge back on our racializing imagination. So, for example, there's a cartoon in this chapter that shows a bunch of like countries in Europe, or peoples, I guess, and they're all represented by different dogs. And maybe this doesn't translate well on an audio medium, but I don't know. You'll get the idea. This person writes, such canine-inflected racial geographies of empire would assume cartographic proportions by the end of empire through maps satirically depicting European imperial powers as purebred dogs. One example is Hark Hark, the Dogs Do Bark, published in 1914. The map takes its title from an English nursery rhyme with political origins and uses that may date back to the 11th century. Each major European imperial power figures as a distinct pedigree of canine men, except for Austria, which the caption deems a mongrel. Turkey, by contrast, is represented by the dog of Constantinople, said to be an offal-eating cur. Thus, the distinctions of pedigree first made in Imperial Britain allowed the dog to be used as a racialized geopolitical device. This is another thing I really like about this book. Each chapter has kind of a cultural history piece to it as well.
Oh, yeah.
Showing maybe like how animals figure into like, geopolitical imagination and imperial imagination. And I think that's really fascinating too, to sort of like, I guess, force animals to stand in for all these other weird metaphorized ways that humans are doing violence to each other. It's like, there's a certain symbolic violence that's done to animals in that imperialist work, which I think is pretty fascinating.
There's the cultural history to each part too. That's great. But there's also like a visual aspect to every chapter where there's like a little a picture or a cartoon that they usually tell you about. Man, it's great. Sometimes collected volumes like this of just like a bunch of essays are bad, but this one really good. I like it a lot. All right, let's talk about foxes. What does the fox say? Okay, so foxes in this book are very interesting. There are a bunch of foxes that live under my back porch, so I was really excited to read this part, and it is actually very funny to read in that context. I was reading this just above the foxes beneath my feet, and that was a great experience. So foxes, in terms of like English imperialism, you can kind of guess where they might come in. A fox hunt. That's like the sort of like one cultural moment, I guess, of like 18th century Victorian England is the fox hunt. A really highly ritualized bourgeois pastime. A bunch of guys, a bunch of lords, I guess, not guys, they're lords. They're riding around on their horses. They're sicking their dogs on these foxes, and the foxes are getting ripped to shreds. You've probably seen it in a movie or something. I don't know.
There's a Futurama episode about it.
Oh, there's a Futurama episode about it. Good point. Yeah, okay. The gist of this chapter, though, is really wild because English people, they decided that fox hunting was like such an important and quintessential English thing to do that it should be exported to all of the English colonies. So fox hunting was exported to places like India, Ireland, and Australia, and I think South Africa as well.
Yeah, Canada too.
Oh yeah, Canada. That's right. There's a whole part in there about Canada. Is that nobody fox hunts in Canada anymore, right? That can't be a thing.
Who could say? I have no idea. This country is out of control.
Okay, good point. I'm going to keep pretending it doesn't happen anywhere because I like these little guys, these little foxes. So anyways, everywhere fox hunting was imported, it always exacerbated the relationship between the colonists and the colonized, which is a very interesting thing. Foxes are a part of the class war, I guess, is the moral of the story. So since foxes aren't indigenous to places like Australia, for example, they had to be imported. And when they did, they'd terrorize like the local farmers' crops and their animals, and, you know, eat all of the stuff. So foxes are, I hate saying this. I hate bringing myself to say it. I don't even like to think about the idea, but foxes are mostly vermin is what this book tells me. And I get it, right? If you're a farmer, I can imagine thinking that. Me, as a person that lives in a house and they live in my porch, I think they're cute little guys and I love seeing them. But according to this book, and according to farmers, I guess, they're vermin and they make everyone's lives a little bit harder. But the funny thing is that the British colonists are like, you know, they're colonizing all of these different places around the world. And they're trying to make sure that they can extract the resources from that land. But also because of their dumb, stupid hobbies where they like to hunt foxes, they're also like actively like working against themselves because introducing foxes into the like local ecosystems upset the balance because in the there's nothing to eat the foxes. There's nothing, so the foxes flourish and they're out of control. In Australia, this particularly happens because the British colonists make foxes a protected class. So it's like this very funny thing where these things that are mostly vermin to farmers become a protected class so that these like extremely wealthy colonists can go hunt them with their friends. And in doing so, like it upsets the balance of the entire ecosystem and also like is an active part of like destroying the farms that they're using to extract like the resources from the country. It's all stupid. It's all so dumb. Anyways, this chapter about foxes ends in a really funny way that I liked a lot, and this is the way that it ends. In Britain, the foxes had the last word, no longer pursued by horse and hound, but by creeping suburbanization. Foxes have colonized British cities, especially London. They've migrated into the capital in the thousands, along railway lines, canals, taking up residence in the public parks and domestic gardens. No longer raiding the farmer's henhouse, urban foxes feast on the city's abundant garbage and its vast population of rats, squirrels, and pigeons, with an occasional house pet to vary their diet. I like this part at the end because, most of these stories about animals are kind of bummers. People can't just like think about apes as being cool. As cool guys. They have to be like racialized, and dogs the same way. But at least in this story, we get a nice ending where it's like, and foxes have had the last laugh because they're still now they live under your porch and they like make your dog really mad. So anyways, it's good. It's a good ending to the story. I mean, it's probably bad overall for the the introduction of a animal into different environs and stuff. That's bad. The story about Australia is that like foxes were just like running amok, and they basically made a law where you would get paid by the Australian government to kill a fox because there's so many. But anyways, nice to see that there's a little bit of payback, and I appreciate that.
That's right. The true Franciscan compromise has yet to be reached.
Yeah, exactly. No one has there's no St. Francis just to tell the foxes just chill out, or maybe they did, and that's why the foxes are in the city. It's hard to say. That's right. That is how the Wolf of Gubbio ends, though. Francis tells the wolf that he could just come into the city and people will feed him from their doorways. And I guess that is kind of what's happening.
Yeah, it's true.
Man,
it's true.
It's deep if you think about it.
But the people of the village have to accept it. That's the key. All right, let's talk about whales. There are actually 2 chapters in this whole book about whales. One about an incredibly specific whale, the North Atlantic right whale. But we're going to talk about the chapter W is for Whale, Generic Whales, by Jonathan Goldberg Hiller. It's a great chapter, especially because, as we said earlier, TikTok thinks my favorite animal is a whale, and maybe it is. Maybe that's why I picked this chapter. Who could say? What I really like about it is the beginning of it is basically like, what even are whales to human beings? It does this really fun kind of like greatest hits of how whales have been perceived in human society, at least like Western society for the most part. For example, he talks about how they appear as kind of like weird fish monsters in ancient Greek mythology. They might be kind of biblical sea monsters. Some people have suggested that like the Leviathan is a whale. I don't think so. I think the Leviathan is weirder than that, but who could say? Maybe.
Cryptid. Cryptid for sure.
The biblical cryptid for sure. The whale is sort of a Hobbesian metaphor for sovereignty of the Leviathan. Eventually, the whale takes on a role as a symbol of Jesus, the redeemer of Christian fish. I think that's great. Love the big Jesus whale. But the whale is also a symbol of Satan. So basically, humans have no idea what they're doing with whales. We don't know what they are. We don't know if we like them or not. We don't know if they're literally the devil or God. We can't figure it out. And what I find really fascinating is throughout the chapter, there's this distinction between colonial and indigenous ways of thinking about whales in particular. And some of them are probably obvious to you, right? Like colonists, they see whales as a resource. They pattern even their own navigational behavior around how to get as many whales as they can possibly get. They see whales as a symbol of imperial power. They are hunted for oil for use in lamps. They're hunted for whalebone prostheses, for whalebone dresses, all these kinds of wild things. And, on the other hand, indigenous peoples participate differently with whale ecosystems and patterns, even kind of living together with whales, not in some like romanticized way, but by virtue of the kinds of other hunting that indigenous people do, like taking certain things from the ocean floor and so on, they also like help prepare a habitat for whales. So there's this kind of interesting like dialogue between human beings and whales in those cultural situations. It's a really fascinating chapter because it does kind of go through these two divergent ways of seeing whales as like brute resource or as something to participate with. And what I find really fascinating is by the time you get to the 20th century, you get to the vision of the whale as this like ultimate symbol for everything that's wrong in our ecological relationship to society. So you have the big Save the Whales campaign, which I guess is, I mean, I remember growing up kind of the butt of the environmental joke. It's tree huggers and people who want to save the whales. Those are the two butts of jokes about hippies or whatever. And also you get this weird like sentimentalizing of whales. So SeaWorld contributes to that. You get movies like Free Willy, all these ways that whales are like closer to humans. There's these analogies made between like whale intelligence and human intelligence and so on. They're kind of like the chapter doesn't say this, but they're basically ocean apes if you think about it. They're sort of people, they're sort of animals. They kind of are, blurred creatures that way. And at the same time, indigenous life is kind of romanticized in ways that were turned against indigenous sovereignty as well. There's an interesting kind of like reversal where the settler societies are obsessed with saving the whales. And the chapter tells a story about how there's one instance where one nation wanted to fight for their right to hunt whales because that's part of their life and culture. And it like created this huge cultural argument in the 90s. And there's this kind of really bizarre situation, right, where like the Save the Whales crowd, which often romanticizes indigenous life, couldn't stomach the idea that indigenous people wanted to hunt whales as part of their relationship with whales. So all that to say, colonialism is extremely weird. Just a bunch of people kind of asserting their specific vision over what whales are and should be, and whether or not we should protect them or hunt them and how. And also mobilizing those visions against other human beings and their own relationships to whales, in particular indigenous peoples. I thought it's a great chapter because, like, you could get the impression that, humans, they act in weird ways with respect to animals. But what's great about the book in this chapter in particular is that it's always pulling out the kind of imperialist specificity. Like, specific humans relate to animals this way, and that sets off this kind of chain of problems. So this is a good one because it includes a lot of the other side of maybe a different way of relating to whales.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning too. I mean, the specificity of how some humans act towards animals is good. Like we've talked about this in the past. I mean, we did a whole episode on the value of the whale book, but there's a whole IMF white paper about like how much a whale means economically. How much is it worth economically in terms of like it as a carbon sink or something. And it's stupid, man. It's so weird because I don't think, the average person thinks all that much about animals, or, they don't think about them in a significant way. But there's so much culturally going on with our metaphors of our self-understanding, of our understanding of other people because of the ways that we think through and of animals. And man, I don't know. We should think about it more. We should think about animals a bit more because I think there's a lot going on there in terms of like what it means to be a person or how we imagine ourselves in the world.
Yeah, or how to be an animal ourselves in the world.
That's true. Oh boy. There's one other part I kind of want to mention really quickly because I thought it was good in terms of the specificity of like how some people think of animals. There's a part in the book called C is for Cattle by Renisha Mawani, one of the co-editors of the book. So this whole section is about cattle, cows, as you can imagine, and their particular import to colonists as a food source. And I think it's interesting for a lot of reasons because, as a white person who grew up in North America, beef is like a pretty important thing. But even as a white person that grew up in North America, you guys have no idea how important beef is in England, in Britain. I think in general, it's everywhere here. People love it. And it's like a pretty important cultural situation. And anyways, that plays out through the colonizing efforts of the British Empire as well. So, any place that like colonists go, cows basically go to, for usually for worse, because they don't belong in those places, like in terms of the environment or ecology. So anyways, with regard to that particular idea, there's a bit in the chapter that I think is worth talking about, and it's this: cattle were not indigenous to North America, Hawaii, or Australia. Though they were brought to the far regions of Britain's empire through the movement of colonists and settlers, they became agents of colonization in their own right. The introduction of cattle allowed settlers new ways to dispossess indigenous people from their ancestral lands, waterways, and natural resources, and to overwrite indigenous claims to sovereignty and self-determination that remain ongoing sites of struggle today. Here's an example. In Hawaii, cattle dramatically altered land environments by destroying local ecosystems. Cattle farming initiated processes for deforestation and introduced deadly diseases that carried serious implications for human and non-human ecologies. Cattle fed off plants that were vital to indigenous life and also provided rationales for territorial displacement. I think this section is actually really important too, in terms of like the ways that some people are thinking about animals and the ways that like we shouldn't think about animals. But like, an idea we've talked about on the show before is the idea of like structural adjustment, the ways that big economic, organizations like the IMF or the World Bank or, whoever, one of them, all of those big ones out there, they will, get a particular colonial space or post-colonial space, like ready for a type of capitalist production, or try to integrate it into capitalist production. And usually we think about that in terms of enclosure, like how do you dispossess an indigenous population of their land so that they can't be subsistence farmers and they have to be, they have to sell their labor to a capitalist or whatever. And usually that is like, it's like building a factory. It's like getting someone to sell the land. It's seizing the land or whatever. But I guess what's really interesting is like that cattle is a part of that story in a really live way that, you can't have cattle in a place without having grazing space, right? Or space for that cattle to be and living its life. So anyways, it's interesting though that cattle is like, it's caught up in those particular like machinations of imperialism, and like on purpose too. Like, they do it all on purpose. That's like, there's no part of imperialism that's accidental. But interesting though, it's not the way that like anyone probably thinks of their big juicy burger or whatever, but that's the story of cattle in North America, in places like Hawaii, Australia. It's the story of, imperialism, of the dispossession of land. Wild.
Yeah, it is wild. It makes me wish that there was actually a US version of this book, because learning about the British imperialist imagination is really interesting, and it kind of allows you to dig into a deep archive of stuff. And I don't know, British people are weird in terms of like the way that the bourgeoisie and the nobility are just so like easy to hate, or the aristocracy is really easy to be like, yeah, that obviously sucks. Like fox hunting is insane. Why would you do that? But the cattle chapter in particular made me think about the US, where cattle are just so obviously part of the colonial imagination, right? Like, I mean,
right.
The cowboys and Indian story, or just seeing cattle as, I guess, a symbol of status and the size of people's ranches and all that kind of stuff. And it makes me wonder too, what other kind of like U.S. Particular U.S. imperial imaginaries fund the bestiary. We got to get these editors to just do some more weird bestiaries around other imperial powers and how to think about animals.
What a great American thing to do, to go to some academics to be like, hey, you wrote this great book about the UK and like British imperialism. Can you do it for America so we can just kind of read it?
They can do it for the French too, the Spanish, the Portuguese. I'll take them all. I'm just saying the cowboy is such a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this other section of the book that I think is really fascinating, and I didn't write any notes for it, and we don't really have that much time to talk about it. But it's about there's a section called U is for unicorn. And I read that one right away because the national animal of Scotland, my new homeland, the place that I'm living for a while at least, is the unicorn. Well, that's funny because it's not a real animal. But anyways, this whole chapter is kind of about the imaginary of the unicorn and like where it comes from, what does it mean? But it's super fascinating because it ends up being a chapter about Orientalism and the ways that people in the British Empire, um, like kind of, I don't know, maybe duped is not the right word, but they did get duped into buying a lot of like quote unquote traditional Chinese medicine that was like ground up unicorn horn, that had all kinds of interesting medicinal properties. Anyways, I loved it. It was great. A great chapter, very fun to read.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ones in here. There's a good one on mosquitoes. There's, like I said, a good one on an incredibly specific whale. Lots of other animals running around in here. It's a great book. We probably should have focused on things that maybe aren't as even familiar. There's some good ones of animals I've like never heard of, but are important in the colonial imagination. It's a great book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. If there was an American version of this book, there would definitely be a section about Bigfoot, though, right? That would be the imaginary animal that we could throw into the mix.
That's right. Definitely the Mothman, he'd be in there, all of them.
Yeah. Man, writing the same book, but about cryptids would be fun. Anyways, Dean, we're kind of closing in on the end here. What are we thinking about this Franciscan project, right? I mean, Francis, he's this guy, he's rescuing rabbits from traps. He's making sort of a peaceful situation, a pact with this wolf in this town. What do we think about this book, though, as I don't know, as people who are interested in St. Francis as a person and his approach to animals, and then like all the stuff about imperialism? What do we make of all this?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, the challenge of the book is to think through how do you have an anti-imperialist understanding of animals, and how do you also do justice to the ways that racial capitalism and all its tendrils of other forms of injustice, how do you be responsible or attentive to the ways that those systems have not only harmed human beings, even though that's extremely important, but also harmed all the rest of the things on our planet. I mean, you could kind of think in the same way about plants, right? You could think about so many other forms of life. And I think what St. Francis does is just tries to suggest a way of being in the world, a way of relating to creation that would subvert an imperial appetite. What's hard is like, there are all kinds of contradictions there, right? As I said, the Franciscans were the big colonial force in the Americas and many other places too. So they didn't get the memo, I guess. But I do think that the way St. Francis treats animals is instructive for a kind of anti-imperialist relationship, one where you have to like reach a compromise with the wolf instead of killing it or getting rid of it or being like, you're not allowed to be here, because the priority is the humans. Instead, the priority is being like, we're all kind of stuck with each other and we have to figure out what we both need and how to address those needs in a mutual way. I don't know, Matt, what do you think? What does St. Francis have to say after reading this Anti-Imperial Bestiary?
Man, I have no idea what he has to say, but what I have to say is that, I mean, what you're saying is good, right? Like, we have to think about animals in ways that are anti-imperialist, but I think like even beyond that, we just have to think about animals. We have to think about creation. We have to think about like ecology, I think, more than we do. I'm a person who is, I don't know, really trying to stretch my brain to think in a less anthropocentric way all the time about things. I mean, whatever that might actually mean. You can't really do it because, I mean, who knows how a cow thinks or a whale thinks? I don't know. It's all kind of speculative. But you're trying to take more things into consideration than just like the human viewpoint of the world or whatever, or what might be good for humans. And I think at least what this book does is it shows you all of these things that people have done with animals and alongside animals, and like thinking through like the imaginary relationship with animals. And it shows you like how dumb it all is, I guess. And I guess just like kind of gives you eyes to see, because I think even as a person who's like trying to think in less anthropocentric ways, I still don't think about animals all that much, because I just like don't see them all that much. And I probably in a lot of ways think of myself very separate from them. And maybe I shouldn't, is what this book is kind of telling me, because so much of like the life that I live and the life that we all live is like really kind of in the shadow of these like particular organizations of other beings that we barely ever see. It's like, I don't know, I'll go take a walk out side and I'll be like, oh man, look at all these sheep. Isn't that cool? And I don't ever think anything else of it. You know, I don't ever think, why are these sheep here? What are they doing? What are like, what problems are they causing? What solutions do they lend? You know, all this kind of stuff. When, you know, the deforestation of Scotland is also a pretty huge problem, right? You know, it's not just like, of course, like the colonized situation is definitely true for the British Empire, but also like the deforestation of Scotland has been a big part, and like it was done through cattle, through grazing of sheep, like on the sides of hills and stuff, you know, and now there's like no trees there. So all that to say, like these conversations, I think, are not like in the past. They're not Victorian conversations, even though that's like the scope of this book. I think they're pretty live and active even today.
I love it. Well, on that note, my cats need to eat dinner, as they have been telling me this whole time, and is probably responsible for a lot of noise interference throughout this whole episode. So I'm going to feed them. And until next time, thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us at $2 or more, you can get into our Discord where we're doing a big Bible study all year round. We're just slowly making our way out of the Torah. And it's going to get really weird in there very soon. So you can jump on board. You can start wherever. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else.